My boss paid me to spy on his wife. But after a few days of surveillance, I realized something was very wrong. The system wasn't watching her. It was watching him. And somehow, I was already part of it. I want to start with the smell. But for me, that's where it begins. Leather and something herbal. And under all of it, the faint chemical bite of new construction, because the building had only been open 6 months and the walls still hadn't fully off-gassed. Then, by November, I stopped noticing it. By then it smelled different somehow, the way a familiar place smells wrong once you know something terrible happened there. I'm 34 years old. Mostly domestic cases. Before that, I did 3 years in Army intelligence, which sounds more glamorous than it was. I was not a hero. I was a guy doing a job I'd been hired to do. And after that, I was a guy trying to figure out what to do with that information in a way that didn't get me killed or imprisoned, or both. Or mostly in order. The way the information arrived is the story. So, I met him on a Tuesday in late September. I'd learned not to push on that. He said he had a sensitive matter. He said money was not a primary concern. They told me the client was experienced with this kind of arrangement. They told me he'd already decided what the job was worth and was willing to pay it. In my experience, people who lead with money is not a concern are usually either very wealthy or very desperate. Marcus Hale, I'd learn, was both. That detail will matter later. Just a very tall building with a lobby that required a key card to access the elevator bank. He was 51. You could still see the frame of a once athletic build, now carrying an extra 25 pounds in the specific way men do after years of client dinners and sedentary mornings. All structure and gravity. He said, "Thank you for coming." I said, "Of course." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Behind him were floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of most of the city's north and east, Lake Michigan on the horizon, steel gray and enormous. "I believe my wife is involved with another man. Tell me what you know so far." He said, "I know the signs. She's distracted. She's working late on a schedule that doesn't match her actual work calendar. Then she recovered too smoothly." I said, "What was the logistical problem?" He said, "She told me she'd had drinks with a colleague in River North. The bar is on the same block as a hotel she's used before, on legitimate business, and I had a feeling, so I drove by that hotel around the time she would have been leaving. She didn't drive to drinks. That wasn't the absence of emotion. The kind of control that takes years to build." I said, "I need to ask a few standard questions." He said, "Ask." I said, "How long have you been married?" He said, 14 years. I said, "Children?" He said, 2. Both at school in the suburbs. I said, "What's your wife's name?" He said, "Catherine. Arts funding, specifically. It's a legitimate organization. She's been doing it for 6 years. I said, "And you?" "We acquire and restructure mid-sized commercial real estate assets." "Sufficient," he said. At the time, looking at the office, the building, the handmade shoes on his feet, I estimated substantial and kept moving. People in high-stakes business sometimes apply threat assessment habits from work to their personal lives. He said, "I've asked myself that. The signs are behavioral, not analytical. I can see the shame." I said, "All right. I'll need a $5,000 deposit to begin." He did it the way people write checks when the amount is inconsequential, with the handwriting of somebody paying a utility bill. "I want this done thoroughly." I said, "I'll start this week." He said, "One more thing." He said it the way people say one more thing when the one more thing is actually the thing. The part they've been steering toward. Not just professionally confidential. No reports filed with any licensing authority. Cash payment of expenses. I looked at him. Usually it came from people worried about privacy. Their business in public. Those two types require different handling. Always. I'm asking you to be discreet in a way that goes beyond the standard. If this becomes known in my professional network, the damage would be significant regardless of the outcome. I said, "I understand." I cataloged them the way I cataloged everything. Without reacting. The first was the security setup in reception. The coverage was redundant in a way that suggested the cameras weren't for general security. The second was his assistant, a young man named Theo, as I'd later learn. Alertness. The third was the file on Marcus's desk. It looked natural. The fourth was his phone. People who are paranoid about their spouses tend to guard their phones. Usually the risk of an incoming notification they don't want anyone else to see. He said he found it in her coat pocket 2 days later. People who are casually suspicious don't usually wait 2 days to check coat pockets. Waiting 2 days and then checking suggests someone who already knows what he's looking for and is waiting for the right moment to confirm it. $10,000 when I'd asked for $5. Not because he was generous. Obligated. I drove back to my office in Pilsen, a converted storefront I'd been in for 4 years, and sat at my desk thinking about those 6 things for a long time. She'd helped me navigate the legal geography of this work since my 2nd year in business. She asked what my gut said. I don't know what yet. She said, then you document everything from the start. Protect yourself. I said, I always do. She said, you usually do. Standard approach. I pulled her public social profiles, her nonprofit's public records, her professional calendar as far as it was publicly listed. She was 47. Her public presence was substantial for the nonprofit world. A TEDx talk from 3 years earlier about the relationship between arts funding and neighborhood economic health, which I watched twice and found genuinely interesting. Her professional reputation was uniformly excellent. She drove to her office, a converted loft in Fulton Market. Lunches. She went to the gym Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Attended a nonprofit board meeting Thursday evening that lasted until 9:30. The second week, something changed. She left her office at 12:40, which wasn't unusual, and drove to a parking structure on Michigan Avenue rather than a restaurant or coffee shop, which was. Then she got out, walked to a specific spot near the stairwell, and met a man who came from the stairwell rather than the elevator. He was mid-40s. Average height. The kind of appearance designed to register as forgettable, which is itself a kind of signal. No physical contact. Their body language was not the body language of an affair. Efficient, slightly tense, focused on information. He disappeared into the stairwell. I'd shot 400 frames. I had the coat, his build, the way he moved. I sent nothing to Marcus yet. A photograph without context is just proof of presence. The following Tuesday, she did it again. A coffee shop in Wicker Park with a back entrance through a small attached bookshop, which meant you could enter from one street and leave onto another without anybody watching the front ever seeing you. The same man arrived 3 minutes later through the bookshop entrance. I heard most of it. Coffee shop noise covered some of it. She said, the timeline is moving faster than we planned. He said something I didn't fully catch, then, pressure from above to close the window before the Q4 filing. She said, if we move before we have the documentation, the whole thing unravels. He said, I know that. 6 weeks. She said, 6 weeks isn't enough. He said, then we have a problem. Then, quieter, almost too low for the microphone to catch, he said, does he know anything yet? She said, no. He left through the bookshop. I sat there for 10 minutes after she was gone, staring at a book I hadn't read a word of. I had spent 7 years listening to the conversations of people who were having affairs. The mix of guilt and excitement. This had none of that. These were 2 people managing a project with a deadline, a timeline, and a risk that needed to be contained. Him, I was now pretty sure, meant Marcus Hale. Catherine Hale was building a case. Because the choice I made in the next 48 hours is the choice that put me in the middle of something much bigger and much more dangerous than anything I'd ever walked into before. Though I understood enough to know I was crossing a line. I went back to my office and looked at everything I'd gathered so far. The audio recording. The language I'd heard. I pulled Marcus Hale. I could build the Surface version in 20 minutes online. Wharton MBA. Founded Sovereign Capital Partners 11 years earlier. A brief mention in a Tribune profile of Chicago private equity from 4 years before. The Surface version was clean. Empty of anything useful. Public records. Property records. I knew people who could provide access to certain business intelligence databases that required, in theory, a professional reason for access and received, in practice, a modest fee and a plausible one. Mostly because it was spread across multiple states, multiple corporate entities, and multiple layers of holding structures clearly designed by somebody who knew how to make things hard to see. Real assets. Real transactions. A web of LLCs registered in Delaware and Wyoming holding partial interests in some of Sovereign's properties. The LLCs had their own owners. I traced what I could and stopped when the chain disappeared into jurisdictions where beneficial ownership wasn't publicly available. I want to be very clear about that. And the shape was this. Money moving through real estate transactions in a structure complex enough to obscure where it came from and where it was going. A woman named Petra Vasic. She was expensive. And she had the rare gift of explaining complicated financial structures in plain language without talking down to you. Not everything. She was quiet for a moment. She went quiet again. But the situation you're describing is not something you want to be holding documentation on independently. And those people will notice when a private investigator in Chicago starts pulling the same threads they've been pulling for 18 months. I said, "Are you saying this is a federal investigation?" She said, "I'm saying I can't tell you what I'm saying. Don't use your office line." Then she hung up. The heating unit made a sound it sometimes made, a low metallic knock that I'd stopped hearing years earlier. I thought about the 6 things I'd noticed in Marcus Hale's office the first day. The coffee shop. The "does he know anything yet?" I had been hired to build evidence against a woman who, as far as I could now tell, wasn't having an affair at all. And the man who hired me to find evidence against her was, in some configuration I still couldn't fully see, the subject of a much larger inquiry. I was licensed. I hadn't falsified anything. I hadn't done anything a reviewing board would flag as improper. And I was in that position because I'd been hired by the man who appeared to be the subject of it. Either he genuinely believed Catherine was having an affair and knew nothing about the other thing, in which case I had wandered into something that wasn't mine and needed to navigate out of it very carefully. Both possibilities were dangerous. The second meant my client was actively using me as part of a strategy one didn't understand and had never agreed to. I didn't let myself think about it long, but it was there. That the affair narrative was never about finding out what she was doing. That by building a surveillance record on Catherine, I was potentially giving him a tool to discredit or derail whatever case she was building. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in Logan Square. It's not impressive. The kitchen is functional, not attractive. I made dinner. I ate it standing at the counter because I wasn't really capable of sitting down. I had a rule. The rule was this. I don't lie to clients. I may hold back information that isn't ready to be shared. And I don't put myself in a position where I'm somebody else's instrument without knowing whose instrument I am. Which meant I had to find out more before I could figure out how to get out. I searched Marcus Hale the same way. I found a story from 8 months earlier. Page 12. It was about a federal investigation into what the reporter described as potential real estate fraud in the Southside Industrial Corridor, specifically around properties acquired through private equity vehicles in the years after the 2008 financial crisis. But it quoted an anonymous source describing a years-long pattern of asset acquisition through investment vehicles designed to obscure beneficial ownership, with rents and sale proceeds that didn't match market rates in ways suggesting the properties were serving some financial purpose beyond normal real estate investment. I wrote her name down. I told her I had information relevant to a story she'd written. I told her I needed to understand the landscape before deciding what to do with it. Then she said, "Are you involved?" I said, "I was hired in a way that may have been designed to involve me without my understanding." Just a name. It wasn't a name I recognized. I said, "What does it mean?" She said, "It's a case designation." Not without going to them directly. They know you took the case. The investigation is older than that. I said, "Thank you." She said, "Be careful." I told lobby security I had a scheduled appointment, which I did not. That bought me the small advantage of seeing Marcus's first reaction to my unannounced arrival with my own eyes instead of through Theo's polished composure. But not controlled enough. He said, "Joel, I needed to speak to you face to face." Then he said, "Sit down." I sat. I was going to tell him some of what I'd found, not all of it, and then watch him very carefully. I said, "I've been following your wife for 10 days. It's professional." His face did nothing. "But the man she's meeting with is not a romantic partner." He said, "Are you sure?" I said, "I've been doing this for 7 years." Picked up a pen. Then he said, "I see." I said, "What I need from you, if I'm going to continue effectively, is more information about your wife's professional network." "What made you think of Sovereign?" he asked. "Standard practice." He said, Sovereign and Catherine's organization have no overlap. I run commercial real estate. Do you know whether she has any relationships with federal investigators or regulators? I don't know any better way to say it. He said, why would you ask that? I said, because if the person she's meeting with has a law enforcement connection, it could explain the nature of the meetings without indicating anything improper. He said, what makes you think there's a law enforcement connection? I said, the way they meet. It feels like a relationship being deliberately kept from observation. He stood up and walked to the window. I watched his reflection in the glass. The expression of a very intelligent man deciding how much he could safely give away. Keep watching her. And Joel? I said, yes. He said, don't pull any more records on Sovereign. I drove to a parking garage 3 blocks away and sat in my car thinking about that last instruction. He hadn't told me I had pulled records on Sovereign. Which meant he already knew I had. I drove to a parking lot behind a grocery store in Ukrainian Village and made 2 calls. I told her I needed her to hold a sealed envelope for me. She asked what was in it. The second call was to a number saved in my phone under the name Electrician, which was not an electrician. He'd done 12 years with DEA before a bad shooting took him off active work and into what he called, without irony, consulting. He knew which agencies were running what kinds of operations in which cities. I told him everything this time. The client. The parking structure. The financial records. The Tribune reporter. He listened without interrupting. If the investigation is what the reporter suggested, and if Hale is the subject, then Catherine is either cooperating with the investigation or she's running a parallel private action. Or working with a whistleblower attorney. I said, cooperating with what agency? He said, the profile you're describing, layered LLCs, industrial properties, transactions that don't match market rates, that's money laundering architecture. The fact that it's been going on for 2 years suggests the latter. I said, and Hale knew enough to hire someone to watch her. He said, if he knew she was cooperating, he'd need to know what she had. How far along it was. Or he's using you to build something he can use against her. A PI following her, documenting meetings with federal agents or cooperating investigators, that could be framed as evidence of conspiratorial behavior, depending on how it's presented. I said, so I've been building the other side's case without knowing it. He said, potentially. He said, 1, you walk away immediately. Let whatever is happening happen without you. Write a final memo saying you found no evidence of infidelity. What Hale hired you to do. What you think he's using you for. But being adjacent to a target, employed by a target, inside a federal investigation is uncomfortable even when you've done nothing wrong. Maybe deposition. It just ends your control over it. He still knows you know things. Then I said, there's a third option. He said, there usually is. I said, I go back to Catherine. He went quiet. And your option 2 gets delivered faster than you can control. I said, maybe that's not the worst outcome. He said, Joel. The people running this have spent 2 years building it. I built a complete record of everything I had gathered. Every audio file. Every note from every conversation I'd had since taking the job. Then I made 3 copies on separate drives. 1 stayed on my person. I had been right. I said, I have a development. 6 o'clock. I said, somewhere neutral. Then he said, there's a restaurant on Randolph. It was a private dining room in the back of a restaurant I knew by reputation. I got there at 5:50. All the small dominance signals of a man who managed his environment carefully. He had placed himself with his back to the wall and a clear line of sight to the door. When the server offered me a drink, I declined. I said, his name is Thomas Brent. The meetings your wife is having with him are not personal. Based on what I've gathered, she's been working with him for roughly 8 to 10 months. He said, working with him how? I said, I think you know how, Marcus. The silence that followed was long. Glassware. Muffled conversation. He said, you've gone beyond the scope of your engagement. I said, I went where the evidence went. He said, you were hired to surveil my wife. I said, I was hired to determine whether your wife was having an affair. What I found instead is relevant to your situation in a way I think you need to understand. He said, my situation. I said, Marcus, I'm not working against you. His face stayed still. I watched that hand the way I watched everything. I think the surveillance documentation I was creating was meant, eventually, to be presented as evidence that she was engaged in some kind of conspiracy or clandestine activity. He said, Catherine is doing something that could destroy everything I built. $300 million in assets under management. The investments of people who trusted me. It's politics. They are building a case that is selective and incomplete, and it will destroy real things that real people depend on. I said, what are those real things built on? He said nothing. I'm not a forensic accountant. Every successful private equity firm has transactions that look irregular in isolation and make complete sense in context. Still controlled, but just barely. You have been operating in my orbit, and that means you have exposure you may not fully appreciate. I said, is that a threat? He said, it's information. What they do with it is their business. Then he left. I sat there for a few minutes after he was gone. Looked at the closed door. I walked out of the restaurant and kept walking, south on Randolph, for maybe 6 blocks in the cold, hands in my pockets, thinking. I was probably the only person in it who wasn't on the way to somewhere comfortable. I had not planned to go directly to the investigators. Ray had laid it out as one of the 2 real options. But the conversation in that private room changed the calculation. Not in what he said. He had not denied the structure. He had defended his practices in the abstract and warned me about my exposure. Not Catherine's. Mine. He was telling me my presence in his orbit was leverage. The next morning I called the number Sandra Okafor had given me, the one tied to the case designation she'd offered as a key. Asked for financial crimes. Got transferred twice, sat on hold, and then a man picked up and said his name was Agent Diaz. I said, I've been working as a private investigator on a case that I believe intersects with a matter you're already aware of. I've had direct contact with the subject. A table. Fluorescent light just a little too bright. Neat. He had that specific kind of attention people in his line of work develop, the ability to hear everything you say while also assessing what you're not saying. She introduced herself as Agent Torres. She was the one I needed to be precise with. All of it, in order, from the first phone call to the private room the night before. The check. I described Catherine's meetings. The timeline. The does he know anything yet? Petra's reaction. The Tribune reporter. Torres looked at Diaz. Then she said, Mr. I was precise about all of it. Which were through the database access I held through my licensing. Everything I'd done was defensible. The lines were what kept me licensed. Walk me through that. I did. She said, and you still have all of this? I said, I have everything. I have conditions. Diaz looked at me. I said, I'll give you everything. But I need something in writing. I need that before I hand over the drives. Torres said, that's a reasonable request. She left the room. He shook my hand, sat down, and said he appreciated my coming in. He told me the investigation I had found traces of had been running for 26 months. He told me Catherine Hale had become aware of irregularities about 2 years earlier through her work as a nonprofit director, because some of her grants had occasionally intersected with the same property ecosystem in ways that hadn't made sense until they suddenly did. He told me Marcus Hale knew the investigation existed and had known for about 6 months, through people in his legal and financial network who had fed him fragments. Just enough to know scrutiny was closing in. He said, the reason he hired you was not primarily to build a case against his wife. The man she's been meeting with, Thomas Brent, our consulting forensic accountant, is not widely known in the public domain. By having you follow Catherine and document her meetings, Hale was trying to identify Brent without alerting our investigation that he knew about Brent. I said, he wanted to identify your cooperating investigator. Walters said, yes. I said, what would he have done with that identification? Walters looked at me steadily. Financial pressure. These are people who understand how to make an environment uncomfortable for a specific person without leaving obvious fingerprints. I said, so I almost handed him the identity of your key investigator. He said, you came in before that happened. I said, tell me what happens to me now. He said, you're not a target. You'll need to be available for deposition when the case moves forward, which we expect in the next 12 to 18 months. Your licensing board will not receive any notification from our office. I said, and Marcus Hale? He said, Mr. The timeline on that I can't share. I sat with that for a second. Hale is going to be fine. He said it simply, with the kind of directness that told me he understood the question underneath the question. That's not something we take lightly. I said, she knows he hired someone to watch her. He said, she's known since about a week after you took the case. I said, how? He said, Thomas Brent is good at his job. He made you in the coffee shop. About getting made by a forensic accountant in a coffee shop and not knowing it. What to say? The 6 weeks comment, the does he know anything? To see what I'd carry back to Hale. He didn't answer right away. The only way to do that was to let it run and see. I said, so I was being used by both sides. He was quiet for a moment. That's different from being used. I said, is it? He said, mister. You came in voluntarily. It was already fully dark. The city was doing what cities do in the early evening, filling up with motion, people leaving one thing and going to another. Just walked. The redundant cameras. The covered file. The 2-day delay before checking the coat pocket. I had noticed all of them. I had known something was wrong. The distance between a complicated domestic situation and a 26-month federal financial crimes investigation is not really a difference of kind. And no amount of professional pattern recognition prepares you for the moment when the pattern you're reading turns out to be only the visible surface of something deeper, older, and far more deliberate than you knew. About a woman who had discovered something buried in the financial structure of her marriage and gone to the government with it. A woman who had those conversations in a way that told me exactly enough to make the decision I eventually made. And she had told me just enough to send me in the right direction. I thought I was discovering something she didn't know I'd found. She had known from the beginning, and she had managed the entire thing with a level of precision I, after 7 years of professional surveillance work, had failed to detect. It was also, in its own way, impressive. I sent Marcus Hale a final invoice and a 1-paragraph closing memo stating that I had found no evidence of marital infidelity and was closing the file. I sent it by courier so there'd be a delivery record. Marcus Hale was indicted 14 months later. The obstruction counts related to efforts to identify and pressure a cooperating government witness, which was what investigators believed he had hired me to help him do. They asked me about every conversation, every document, every decision. His attorneys made an effort to characterize my investigation as part of an illegal surveillance operation targeting Catherine Hale, which was their creative reframing of the fact that I had been hired by their client to surveil her. He was convicted on 5 of the 7 counts. I read about it in the Tribune. Front page this time. She named the case, the evidence, the 14 months of trial proceedings, and in the 14th paragraph she mentioned, briefly, that a private investigator had voluntarily cooperated with the government after discovering that a case he had been hired to work was something very different from what he'd been told. The week before publication, she had called and asked whether I was willing to be identified. She said she thought I'd say that. I said, you've been working it for 2 years. He told me that himself. I was curious enough to say yes. An ordinary one this time. He was quieter. He was careful. He said, the Subaru has a specific dent in the rear quarter panel. I wasn't looking for a PI. Different client. I was doing background on an acquisition target. We were both watching the same building on different floors for about a week. I said, I don't remember you. He said, I know. And because you never looked up. It's good fieldcraft. We described the vehicle. She's been through a great deal, and she's handled all of it with more composure than most people manage. I said, how is she? He said, that's not something I can share in detail. Then I asked, was any of that October meeting real? 6 weeks was real. She wasn't inventing it. I said, and the does he know anything? He said, that was real too. She was doing something very difficult, and she was genuinely afraid. Not in whether she felt it. I drove home that evening through a light snow, the first of the season. I drove carefully because the Subaru's tires needed replacing and I had been meaning to replace them for months. About a woman who found evidence of something wrong inside her own life and acted on it, even though acting on it was going to cost her a lot in several different currencies. Stability. She did it anyway. She's working with people who have an agenda that is not about justice. Or whether he had to believe it, because the alternative was harder. I thought about the 9 years. About what I had done, what I had almost done, and how different those two things probably looked from the outside versus the inside. From the inside, it felt like a series of decisions made under incomplete information, each one narrowing the options until the only remaining option was also the right one. The firm continued. The investigators and prosecutors had been careful, in a way I hadn't expected but came to appreciate, to structure the case so the legitimate parts of the business didn't collapse with the criminal ones. The receivership handling the criminal proceeds tried to preserve employment and operational continuity while unwinding the illegal structures. I had no part in it. That distinction mattered. It was triggered by a standard disclosure in the court documents that a licensed PI had been retained by the defendant. I gave the board complete documentation of my work, my methods, my reasoning, my voluntary cooperation. My license was confirmed. After all of it, I thought about starting over somewhere. A different line of work. In the end, I decided it was. Not because it's straightforward, because clearly it is not. And I wasn't going to abandon it because one case took me into deeper water than I had ever been in before. You swim the same way. I replaced the tires on the Subaru in January. The dent in the quarter panel I left alone. There's no getting around that. The dent is mine. The specific way I position myself in an environment so that I'm in peripheral vision but not direct sightline is mine. I keep them. Different cases. The ordinary landscape of a profession that exists because people need to know things and can't always find out by asking. I ask more questions up front. I still notice things that don't fit. Sometimes they add up to something. And the difference between the something and the nothing usually isn't knowable at the moment you first notice it. That's all the work ever really is. Filing. And then, when the thing you've assembled becomes clear enough, deciding what to do with it. He'll be eligible for review in about 7 years. When I do, I think about the handshake in his office that first day. The pressure calibrated to communicate something specific. Because once you control every visible thing, you stop seeing the things you never thought to control at all. And in the end, that was the only variable that mattered.